Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today, we are very fortunate to have Daniel M. Kammen to speak to us today. I was very impressed with his resume. It's really a fun guy. He's a professor of energy at the University of California, Berkeley, with parallel appointments in the Energy and Resources Group, the Goldman School of Public Policy, and the Department of Nuclear Engineering. He was appointed by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in April 2010 as the first Energy Fellow of the new Environment and Climate Partnership for the Americas, ECPA initiative. In 2016, he began service as the Science Envoy for U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. Kammen is the author of over 300 research articles, over 40 U.S. House and Senate testimonies. That's a lot, because there are a lot of questions when you show up before Congress. And he is a contributing lead author for the IPCC, which shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. So let's welcome Dr. Kammen.
Thanks very much. I'll use that one, okay. So I guess I don't need this one because I'm mic'd up. So thank you all for being here today and for having a talk that I think will be sort of outside of the longer time horizons and larger planetary and galactic focus that you normally do. So I saw two versions of the title that had floated around, so I put them both up here just to be complete. I will certainly be speaking a little more to the first one than to the Drake equation in particular, but I hope that some of the linkages will be fairly obvious as we talk. And I guess as I want to say, as a physicist who wandered into energy work over time, my main message, or actually main plea to this audience today, is that some of the topics that I've seen come up from time to time in this lecture series and some of the things that SETI has worked on, but not the core area, is actually where I'm going to argue our big problem with energy and climate is. And so I'm going to try to flip around what I think is normally the way I thought about giving this talk when I began, which is what is the coolest areas of science and engineering that we think have a major role to play. And I'm going to argue essentially that the science and engineering, while exciting and great fun, is not the area where we are failing worst. And we're not succeeding entirely there, but we are failing worse in other areas. And so that's not a great sign either way around. And so just for those who want to connect, my lab's website is here. It's quite complete. We'd like to think it is quite complete anyway. It has not only the research articles, but a good deal of this kind of public engagement that was mentioned in terms of testimonies. I just came back from the climate conference in Marrakesh, where we did something like 100 interviews, TV shows, debates, a whole variety of things. So there's a lot of material, both very technical and much more policy. And I'll speak on a much more policy basis today, expecting that with the ever worsening, from my personal opinion, set of Trump team announcements that will likely have more discussion about those issues than about some of the science, but you'll see as the talk goes on the things I want to highlight. And then the Twitter is not my vacation pictures. It's actually roughly one tweet a day about work going on in the laboratory and with some of our partner institutions around the world. I'll come back to that a little bit. A snapshot of the team in the laboratory. So it's a fairly large research group as university teams go. There's a number of missing people, but the key feature for us is that the students, postdocs, visiting scientists in the group almost all come from physics, engineering, chemistry, some economics as their core discipline, but all have evolved their research area or topics to connect on what we generally call the science and policy of sustainability. And it'll be kind of your judge as we go on to the degree to which we are, in fact, faithful to that and kind of using, and so doing some new science itself, but really trying to integrate what we're learning in a variety of ways. And I want to jump in on the first slide to kind of give the overall landscape of where we are, not on a policy basis, but on a roadmap to what's sustainable or not, because it really frames a lot of the conversation. And I'll spend quite a bit of time on this next slide, just because it ties a lot of the current data together. And so those of you who follow the climate science story, bear with me, take a nap, respond to Twitter, whatever else. But I want to highlight where we are before we kind of move on in the picture. And so this is essentially the reason why I would argue that we are at a point where we are impacting the Drake equation most dramatically in the last 150 years. And so the biggest change in terms of lifetime of civilization number is at risk as we speak. And I'll come back to that a couple times as we go. But what's shown here is the net CO2 emissions. And for those doing climate math, what this is carbon dioxide, and I will talk later on about the second most critical greenhouse gas, which is methane, far stronger on a per molecule basis, so on a watts per square meter basis, but a much shorter, about 1/10 the lifetime of CO2 in the atmosphere. And I'll come back and forth on a little bit. But in terms of the bulk of our emissions, the black line is this historical trend. The red line is essentially the path that we have been on and ostensibly are still on in terms of emissions, and that is raising the overall temperature by the end of the century by 4 or more degrees. Some of the worst scenarios are higher than 5.5. We'll come back to the better ones based on some current hopeful conversation, although not a lot of action, are somewhat less. But essentially, that red line is the line we were on 8 to 10 years ago. And with some of the recent commitments, not necessarily actions, but commitments, you can argue that this black line, this RCP6, it's one of the scenarios run by this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I'm a part, which shared the 2006 Nobel Peace Prize with Vice President Al Gore, is the most optimistic picture of where we are today. And to frame the conversation, the discussions that have gone on at the International Climate Summits, this annual meetings, the most famous one was this meeting in Paris last year. Before that, the big milestone meetings were 4 years before that in Copenhagen, a meeting that was essentially a disaster in terms of not getting any significant action forward. And the most significant meeting before that, and that was COP15. We're at COP22 right now, the one that just happened in Marrakesh. And did anyone else attend the Marrakesh meeting? Okay, so you guys are busy doing real work. But the most prominent meeting before that was COP3 in Kyoto, where the Kyoto Protocol was signed. And I'll highlight what the numbers reflecting those various pieces are in a second. But essentially, the agreement that came out of the Paris meeting was that the path of 4 degrees or more of warming was unacceptable ecologically in terms of poor communities, in terms of our global planetary health, and that we needed to be at that yellow rust-colored line or lower, RCP 4.5, somewhere in the 1.5 to 2 degree C range is not a world free of significant climate change, but a place where most of the assessments of individual impacts on coral reefs, droughts, fires, changes in tropical and polar ecosystems were absolutely not a world without climate change, but the level of disaster was significantly less. And so if our goal is to bring down global emissions, global net emissions to roughly that level, then that's what the Paris Accords, these informal agreements that happened last year, were. And to put the next piece on the curve, at the same meeting, in this kind of very hopeful time, the 21st of these meetings in a row, a significant consortium of nations, most of the developing nations in the world, the United States, a number of others, Germany, signed on to what was called the High Ambition Coalition. Great name, but not a lot of action yet. And that is that the 2-degree goal is still far too risky, and that 1.5 degrees of overall global temperature change was still a risky target, but was far preferable. And as difficult as the 2-degree target is, this is going to be, of course, even more difficult. California is, and I'll come to this in some detail later on, looking at strategies to get us under 2 degrees, and as science, technology, behavioral issues permit, to push for the 1.5 degrees. And the California delegation plays a major role in these global climate meetings, and has been a very vocal voice for this 1.5 degree target. As you can see, though, these scenarios that get us into this 2 degree and then the 1.5 degree range, you can see just by the scatter plots of net emissions overall, start to get in this very challenging world where if you think that simply reducing greenhouse gas emissions by reducing emissions from 2 primary areas, about 3/4 of global emissions are from fossil fuel use, power plants and vehicles, and about the remaining quarter is due to land use change. And that's going to be a big part of the story going forward. And it's the place where the scientific and ideological disputes are the strongest. But you'll notice that a whole range of those scenarios here start to get into a world where there are negative emissions. And this is taking this really tough, intractable problem of essentially reinventing the world's energy and agricultural systems, but then finding ways to sequester carbon beyond that. And this is going to be the battle about how sustainable our plans are. But just notice that for these scenarios down here, they're color-coded to match. A significant number of them require, love it, thanks, require us to think about negative emissions. At the climate meeting in Marrakesh, thanks so much. Oh, perfect, okay. At the climate meeting in Marrakesh, these negative carbon scenarios were the crowning presentation of the joint efforts by the Canadian, U.S., and Mexican delegations, a significant big bloc. And it is everything from critical area of science to a pipe dream, depending on who you ask. But in terms of limiting the effects of climate change, they're very much on the table. So the second slide I want to spend kind of equal amount of time on is probably the piece of the story that has been the hardest for me to do as a physicist, in the sense that this graph at the left that I'll describe in a little detail here are the kind of the generic, the canonical pictures of how much climate change we are seeing today. And what I'm going to put up over here is the legal and political translation of these pictures here. And I think almost all of us who came into this area of sustainable energy, sustainable land use, biodiversity, a variety of things, from a technical or scientific perspective, and so I'm guessing, but have not talked, the majority of you come from this side as well, is that while we've done a relatively good job of describing the science and describing the solutions, we've done a complete failing job of the translation of that to what and how to do. And so, as I said in the beginning, my biggest kind of pitch or plea today is that as interesting and as exciting as the scientific and engineering side of this story may be, this is actually not where we're failing. And in fact, the science of low carbon systems is one where We always are going to need innovation, and there's lots of challenges about how much we're investing, how much we're translating that into action. But this is actually not the area of failure. 10 years ago, we probably couldn't say that. 10 years ago, the concern about scaling up clean energy systems, and we'll get into some of the details as we go, were really seen as a challenge. But as a couple technologies have flipped from far too expensive in terms of materials and cost and other things to low cost, this argument has switched. And so there is a huge need for new types of thinking about how to translate this story into what's about to come next. And that is the place where I would love to pick off people from SETI and elsewhere to think really hard about it, because the Drake equation sort of goes away if the forecasts for how bad climate change are. The Drake equation doesn't go away, but our ability to be one of those civilizations goes away if we don't figure out a far more rapid way to make change than we so far have been thinking about. And so let me see if this one... Okay, so again, these are the three big trend lines for three big indicators of climate change that are basically shown in every such discussion about where we are. You'll notice two are global and one is Northern Hemisphere, for which we have a shorter data set, and all Californians, of course, are critically concerned about water, for whether it's for skiing or for water or whatever else. But it's a shorter record, but it's trending the same way. And the huge debates around where we are in the climate science have really highlighted this story. And so I want to add to this, if I can get it to, maybe I'll just do this way. Okay, is to highlight what has come out of this international dialogue around climate science. And so what I've listed up here with this first line, I'm doing something wrong. I see. With this first line, this is the first assessment report of the several, it was 100 then, now it's several thousand scientists worldwide that have assessed the climate science and looked at where we are in terms of impact on the planet and in terms of what we need to do about it. And so at this first meeting in 1990, before the Kyoto Protocol, the first of these, the strongest statement that the collective group of scientists, engineers, economists could make and then get through the filter of the UN government nations that got to pick and poke at it and change wording and negotiate, was that unequivocal detection of human impact was not likely for a decade. So that's sort of like making work for ourselves for another decade's worth of time. Many of us argued at the time that, in fact, while we were not several sigma above the noise and the signal, that it was pretty clear we were no longer in a natural state. We were in a human impacted system. But these reports come every 5 years. That's the first one. The second assessment report, the SAR 5 years later, the balance of evidence suggests discernible human influence. And again, it's the translation from this kind of data, natural science picture to wording here, which you can tell was tortured and laborious. In fact, one word here took 8 hours of negotiation. That would be this word right here. And the strongest statement was, yeah, we think we see the signal. And I want to highlight this not because I think the words are absolutely critical individually or because I think the particular point on the graph is so critical, but I really want to set this up in terms of the dialogue between what is essentially a natural science observation of the planetary health and where the global community with all 190 nations participating were prepared to go. The third assessment report, the first thing you might notice is there's been a little slippage in that 5-year reporting, and that was because of the contentious battles over this, certain elections and things going on. Most of the warming in the last 50 years is likely due to human activities, kind of stronger but still not an overwhelming statement. And this is really why I highlighted a few minutes ago that while there is always huge worry about not investing and then deploying enough of these clean energy and other technologies. But going back a little over a decade, we were really at a point when when the debate around the climate signal, what we had available as tools was, unfortunately, fairly early on, given that the graphs, I would argue, have not changed particularly much during these periods, but the wording has changed. The fourth assessment report, notice the slippage is getting larger now. Most of the warming is very likely, over 90% probably, due to human activities. And then the IPCC was set up in a very UN kind of frustratingly political and wordy way, so that the IPCC was not tasked on recommending solutions, which is kind of very UN-esque. It was tasked to assess where we are and assess opportunities. And this was the first statement that the IPCC was both prepared to make and got through the filter of government interactions and negotiations, that warming will most strongly and quickly impact the global poor. And that doesn't say developing the poorest nations. That says the poor worldwide. My wife's a physician in Oakland. She certainly sees many people in the emergency room whose first line of medical care is the emergency room. We observe around the world places that are being affected by crises, whether they're environmental or political. We see this kind of healthcare in the emergency setting rising. And this was really meant to highlight the global plight or the inequality that we observe in how we treat people, and climate change makes this dramatically worse. We then had an interim report, which I directed, has the very nerdy name, the Special Report on Renewable Energy. And it concluded 5 years ago that that global target of decarbonizing the system by 80% or more was possible if, and this is when my days, I learned to program with Hollerith cards and Fortran, I think it was 77, when I was in middle school. And it was literally an if-then statement that was just, goes down through the floor and keeps on going. It was horrific. If we do this about certain technologies, if the prices do this, if the deployment, it was a scary if-then statement because it looked as increasingly improbable. But it highlighted that there was this kind of range of opportunities to get us there. The most recent report was released over 2015 and 16, and it just upped the confidence levels a little bit and said we essentially see this overall story. So again, I've spent a lot of time trying to set up where we are because I really do think that's the most important part of it. And while kind of 5 years ago or so, under what was very positive progress politically under the current U.S. administration and some efforts I'll talk about elsewhere in Europe and China, I stopped showing slides highlighting how dire the climate change story is, and now I fear with new forces afoot, I'm going to have to go back to it. And because much of the debate about climate denialism, about all these features, has highlighted kind of the so-called, quote, left-wing conspiracy of people thinking the sky's falling with climate change, what I'm going to show you here is what I've found over the last 15 years to be one of the most compelling 17-second versions of how dire the climate story is. And I would invite comments at the end, because if this translation from the natural science to the political, social sciences, where I'm going to argue, and I hope you'll agree by the end, we are failing most badly, then part of that is the communication and the dialogue. It's not just, does climate science have a good PR agent, right? Well, I know many physicists of my generation, older generations, who literally think that, and they may be right, that nuclear energy, nuclear fission, literally just needs a better PR agent, right? That there are issues, there are risks with different technologies, but nuclear's problems are essentially in the communication. You can make an argument for that. As a professor of nuclear engineering, I don't actually share that view, but you can make an argument there. And I've heard people say similar things about the climate story. So what I'm going to show you is a NASA set of images. Obviously, they're synthetic. The clouds have been removed, but this is the data set, no models, and that's the key part of the story. It pains myself and many science-based colleagues that once you have models in the story, that the opportunity for debate sort of goes through the roof. That's the political reality of the story. So what I'll show you here will be the images over 30 years showing the extent of North Polar ice, not at a specific day of the year, at the point that we retroactively observe the extent of ice to be at its minimum each year. Happens in late August, early September, and so this again will be a movie, and the graph will be overlaid on the top of that. Oops, but I did it the wrong way by pressing the wrong button. Oh, it doesn't like me in this screen mode. So what I'm going to do, let's see if it'll let me. It's not as pretty this way, but I'll run it in the smaller version here. So in million square kilometers, there's obviously going to be a lot of noise in the signal. There are warmer and colder years. And what you see is, again, the extent of the ice, and this is just the two-dimensional extent. There's been a lot of really interesting data recently, a movie called Chasing Ice, some of you may have seen, about, of course, the ice pack is a three-dimensional entity, and so reduction in the 2D extent is also impacted because we have a pancaking, a diminishing of the volume of the ice as well. So we have almost a 50% reduction in sea ice over the extent of sea ice. It doesn't like it that way. Over I could have done it all along. I'm sorry. Over 3 decades. And again, this is not the perfect version of the story, but clearly the politics of climate change and climate science are just about to re-enter, if maybe they never left, but are going to re-enter the national discussion in a very, very dramatic way. And so finding a model, computational, free version of the story is something which is critical. And of course, those of you following the details of the Trump administration debate so far know that there's been a big debate about NASA and should NASA now only look outward versus inward. And so, I won't get into that in more detail. Many of you are much more expert on this than I, but obviously we would not have this kind of record without that kind of resource. This is a version of the story that I would argue is dramatic, highly salient. There's versions of it you can relate to. The one challenge is that with the average audience, maybe not this audience, the number of people who have been to these locations in the Arctic is low. It's rising, but it's low. I've spent a fair amount of time here in Svalbard in the Norwegian-managed Arctic. And how many people have spent Antarctic or Arctic time in this room? So that's less than I would have guessed for this group. That's interesting. Okay. But again, I'd love to hear comments, but this is a version which I find very compelling in the story. Much of the literature trying to highlight these stories is much more like this, and I find this sadly not that compelling unless you really love the kind of the physics or chemistry one-on-one version. This is essentially the picture I showed you before of that path we were on with 5 or more degrees of warming. And then an argument that we need to be somewhere, I think I put the guard, we need to be somewhere in this 2 degree or less, and again, this 1.5 degree target is the one that's been promoted by the U.S. and other administrations. And then trying to tell the story about the extent and damage of ecosystems, human systems, is really what 1,000 different versions of thermometer graphs and pictographs and all kinds of things have tried to do, and have done a particularly poor job. And again, this is one of the many areas where new novel thinking, I'll be at Google this afternoon where we're having a workshop on communicating big data, but actually getting big wisdom out of the big data, not just big numbers out of the big data, is the topic for today, and no surprise. I think this is a very poor job of telling those stories. All that said, what I really think is the key part of this story, again, there are likely to be questions, and I'll highlight issues around solar power, about fission and fusion, about biofuels, about a whole variety of technologies. But I really think there's this amazing paper from 1968 that I hope many of you have already read, and some people will go back to read. It's called The Tragedy of the Commons by an ecologist, Garrett Hardin, from UC Santa Barbara. And there's lots of interesting things in this particular address. This was the AAAS presidential address of 1968. But I really think that the key aspect of this whole story right here is the one that I don't want to minimize how critical the science and technology of this story is. That's, after all, how I got into it. That's what all my degrees are in. That is not at all easy, but I think that this really captures it. It's our considered professional judgment that this dilemma has no technical solution. What I'm going to argue is that the climate change story is not wanting for new technology, interesting companies, opportunities to deploy, but what we're lacking is this ability, as we've demonstrated by not making this a clear and compelling we must act issue, to find ways to tell this version of the story. And so again, that's what I'm going to focus on. Again, that's why the Drake equation subtitle, I would argue that right now we are having the largest partial derivative here than anywhere else. And this is the biggest risk we've seen. And again, my connection when we talked on the phone is that I was, as probably still am, as nerdy as they come. This is our Boy Scout troop. This is Frank Drake's son. We grew up on the same 2 streets apart, and there I am in all high school, whatever. So anyway, the upside of where we are today is that in 2014, the 2 biggest culprits in terms of economic activity that still is impacting the planet were the U.S. and China. 40% of global energy consumption, 40% of greenhouse gas emissions in 2 countries, and those countries until 2014 were doing bits of efforts here and there, but were absolutely the laggards in the international discussions for different reasons, different politics. But what happened in 2014 was that in the face of that dialogue I described with the science graph and then the kind of the politics of the UN negotiations around climate, the US and China said, F it. We are stepping out of that process, and we are going to do a G2 of climate summit. And at the Asian Pacific Summit in October 2014, President Obama and Premier Xi said, we are agreeing to our own individual climate compact. And it was very unusual in the political science. And my political science colleagues wrote thousands of articles overnight highlighting how unusual this agreement was. Because everything I described in the prior slides was countries of one type, industrialized, developed. They were called Annex 1. It's industrialized countries all committed to the same thing, and developing, industrializing, whatever you want to call it, countries agreed to something else. And what the US and China agreed to without any other international dialogue, in fact, the German negotiators and others were up in arms about this for good and bad reasons, was that what the US and China agreed to wasn't even to do the same thing in the same year. It was, the US said, we will cut our emissions by 1/3 by 2025, and China said, we will peak our emissions in 2030. And of course, not saying where the peak is, there's lots of issues about that, but it was a very significant statement about changing the overall trajectory. And at the time when we looked at them, almost everyone involved in this whole story came up with some version of the following statement. I'm glad they did it. It's an important step. It's insufficient, given that we have to get this 80% cut by 2050 or so to be on that 2-degree path, but it is a good first step in the process. And there was a lot of commentary about how the US version, because it was actually a cut, would bend the curve of emissions over and was not better, but was more hopeful than the Chinese commitment to peak at some unspecified amount of emissions. And at the climate meeting in Marrakesh, after the US election, I would say much of that dialogue had flipped. And that while there's good things and bad things to say about what the US and China are each doing, the Chinese plan in many ways looks far more hopeful in terms of achieving what they've said, and whether that's sufficient or not, we'll talk about at the end. And just note there's lots of important details I'm sweeping under the rug. When the initial version of this dialogue came out about emissions and this need to cut overall emissions by 80%. That was made based on analysis that was done in the 1990s. And so the international community uses 1990 as the baseline. Well, of course, 1990 was a long time ago, and that's very inconvenient because a lot's happened since then. And so the US redefined the baseline to be 2005. Europe was upset. There's lots of issues about the important details of the story, but to move along to some degree and to get to a little bit on the solution space, I'll jump ahead a little bit from there. So as a result of what the US and China did, what the path that Europe had started as well, activities in a few other countries, the Paris Climate Conference was this wonderful success. We have UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon highlighting this with the French team, and we had Ms. Figueres, who wanted his job, didn't get it. She's head of the climate process. She wanted to be UN Secretary General, didn't work out. And what were they highlighting about? What they were highlighting was the following, back to the same graph I described before. This is that overall emissions path, and for those looking at the details, CO2 equivalent per year, so what's now plotted, a little different than the one before, wasn't just carbon dioxide. It's actually methane converted to its CO2 equivalent and added into the story. So there's a bigger land use picture in the story here. So instead of that red line, which you're probably getting bored of now because we haven't done a whole lot of analytic slides, versus this is the line of commitments that all countries made leading up to the Paris Agreement. And largely because of the fact that the US and China stepped out of the process, simply announced targets, didn't have to go through a 190-nation process to figure out where they were. What happened in Paris was countries came up with their own targets based on where they chose to act. Most of the big countries had efforts to reduce emissions in the fossil fuel sector and think about land use, biodiversity, conservation, ocean conservation. Some developing countries that had almost no current fossil fuel power plants or saw themselves as incredibly small emitters on the global scale focused, for example, entirely on land use protection. We're going to save forests, we'll save species, whatever else. And then those commitments, in terms of their carbon impact, were added up. And these national goals tallied and cut off this pink triangle of emissions. Now, notice this is what countries wrote down. None of it has happened, right? So this pink is all commitments of which very little action has happened to date. And so you can argue that we're still on this path here, but certainly in the warm glow after Paris, most negotiators, a lot of scientists, engineers, economists, we're thinking that we now have a viable pathway to do this, recognizing we have to do this or more to get to the 1.5. But we were moving along, and just 2 months ago in Kigali, the global community signed a second accord to limit HCFCs and CFCs further, and that would result in a very small additional emission in the midterm, and then cutting off a 0.5 degree or more in the long term by switching to more benign gases. And so, again, taking this kind of pink as Paris, some adding pieces, you can see that the momentum going into the Marrakesh meeting was much more positive about what countries had committed to do, had not necessarily done yet. And again, back to the same picture we described before, more details on it. That story of emissions, again, is largely going to be a story of fossil fuels, power for power plants, fossil fuels for vehicles. What are the alternatives to replace them? But there's another energy and climate crisis out there. And in fact, it is that 1.5 billion people on the planet today have no significant access to what are called sort of poorly modern forms of energy, so electricity. And because of that, there's huge other health, environmental, economic effects due to burning biomass in very inefficient stoves, lighting systems that are incredibly inefficient, a whole variety of other issues, adding as much as 1 watt per meter square of additional climate forcing. And this whole climate story is about 3.5 watts per meter squared. So it's a very significant story. and when you look around the planet, it's a really depressing picture of, in each case, the pie charts on the left in millions of people show the number of people in each region without modern forms of electricity today, and the pie charts on the right are the forecast for how many will be without access in 2030. So essentially no change from about 1.4 billion without today to about 1.2 billion without in 2030. So huge negative story on where we're going in terms of millions of people without quality access. And so it's not just that we have to do this incredibly steep job of bringing down emissions, but we need to deal with this issue. So I won't spend a long time on it because I've used, again, arguably a lot of the talk kind of doing this sort of motivational piece, arguably. But I just want to highlight, what do we know about large-scale efforts to impact change? And unfortunately, I would say that the story there is even grimmer. So I'm adding on another level of depression to where we were at before. And so I'll take an example that gets discussed a lot, and that would be smoking, as something for which, at least in the US, we've seen a dramatic change. And the question is, what's happened and when, right? So if we go back to kind of classic GI World War II pictures, we have, cigarettes. We have smoking by cigarettes. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Talk show hosts smoking. Cartoon characters smoking. Presidents, movie stars, sometimes together smoking. A whole variety of features of the story. And then you kind of look at, as we observe the story, just how foolish were we as the science came out around this, right? There were times that I see most of the audience, by amount of gray hair, myself included, certainly remember well that while we've seen advertising bans, we've seen a variety of features about how to tax this, how to ban smoking, et cetera, we have seen a significant change of smoking in the US. The interesting thing is, of course, we've seen a significant change. The worrisome thing, of course, here is that the time scale for change of this one relatively small scale activity is actually roughly on the scale that we're talking about needing to do this dramatic climate transformation. And so that should give one a real worry that if we can't even get something like this done, and sometimes our scientific approaches, could we really have been this stupid? This is a Northwest Orient seating map, right? Most of us remember these, when the smoking section was literally the last two rows of first class, and then back here, and if we just totally don't understand diffusion of molecules. And it's just kind of unbelievable. And as one kind of trivial, not trivial, but as one seemingly simple example of something that we ignored the science, and we actually thought for some period of time that, call it an interim solution, transitory. It wasn't that transitory, it went on for a while, but we really are able to blind ourselves to where the science is. And that's a huge worry. And so are we really this dumb, is kind of the picture of it. So I've used almost all my talk time on a long prologue, and now I'll kind of zip through the naughty bits, if you will, but really just to highlight where I think we have a lot of tools at our disposal. The question is, do we use them, right? So when we look at not only the need to decarbonize the system dramatically, we've left ourselves 3.5 decades to this 2050 timetable. We have growing energy demand around the world. Not so much growing in the US and Europe, but certainly growing here. And of course, if I add China to the story, it is a forecast for a massive growing amount of energy. Here's a shot from space of a coal loading terminal in China. These are all coal mounds, loading trucks and things, just to give you a scale and a feeling for where this picture goes. And I haven't mentioned the word equity at all so far, but one version of the story is, I've essentially said that what we need to do is a version of peaking emissions very soon. China plans to peak out here. If the world wants to get on this 2-degree pathway, we're going to have to do something where, let's say, industrialized nations peak fairly soon, like now. So a global pathway here. Emissions in industrialized countries will have to essentially stop growing today, and they have not stopped growing, to leave even a little bit of kind of breathing room, if you will, or growing room for industrializing countries. And this is the story that really makes this look incredibly depressing, because we are not on a path to do this yet. We have not come up with a compact and arguably the U.S. election last month has been a real step backwards in terms of this kind of thinking and use of the science, to start thinking about everything from, there are groups considering what is our global ecological footprint in terms of mining global resources, to a book that I hope many of you read, Elizabeth Kolbert's most recent book called The Sixth Extinction, looking at the major extinctions in geologic history and where we are in terms of potentially right now being on a path where 3/4 of species on the planet may be gone in the next several decades. And so there are multiple aspects of the story. When you look at kind of deforestation watch around the planet, it is truly a grim story about areas that have significant tree loss. So we have a whole variety of versions. And so now that I've depressed you dramatically for 50 minutes of my allocated 59 minutes, let me highlight why, despite everything I've said, I actually think that if we could get this dialogue, and I'm not saying communication now, but this dialogue issue correct, I actually think we are well armed to get there. So I'm going to go back to a slide made when slides were truly made by draftsmen. This is a slide made by Enrico Fermi's last PhD student, Art Rosenfeld, a UC Berkeley professor and LBL scientist, now in his 90s and in exceedingly ill health, unfortunately. And his vision of this story for California was that if we look at total planned energy, new capacity growth, the kind of 5% growth numbers. Right now, California's energy demand is growing by less than 1%, but many developing countries are doing exactly this. And the amount that was forecast to come from nuclear, fossil fuel, hydro, and geothermal energy was essentially a version of that red versus black graph I've been showing repeatedly in the talk. And that is, if this is our planned path, Art Rosenfeld's version of the future was, by really being smart about energy efficiency, we could essentially conserve our way down from a growth path of over 5% to essentially something we've done even better than, where our growth is now under 1%, cutting out the need for massive amounts of new power plants despite a growing population. In fact, California did better than this, largely due to people like Art. And if we look at electricity consumption in the US and California, and I'll just index them to the same level here. So here we have the rest of the United States and California in blue, by a series of energy efficiency efforts in the industrial sector, in the commercial sector, and the residential sector. California essentially did exactly what we described. So hugely important. California essentially cut out that triangle of emissions, all in the efficiency side. And the debates about how impossible this was going to be for lots of reasons. Energy efficiency was not as big a deal as the promoters, both on the research side and the implementation side, said, and that you couldn't run an economy on just simply reducing amounts of energy use for various technologies. This story really emboldened California and others to recognize that if you can do this on the efficiency side and couple that with the resources that are out there, so this, I won't do the numbers in detail, but this is global energy use today in terawatts, and our natural gas resources that have grown somewhat due to fracking at about another 30 to 40% on that. Petroleum, uranium, and coal are here, but of course a solar resource and then all of the other renewables in here. But huge amount of energy available if we wanted to harness it. This story, of course, has been known for decades. The challenge has been that all of these renewable technologies have either been too expensive, too intermittent, too spatially localized for us as a community to think this was a possible path. Solar is still a relatively small amount, about 1% of global energy consumption in terms of modern electricity, but it's fascinating. When I started working on these topics decades ago, the idea that solar would play anything more than a trivial role for a couple, hippies in California and Vermont and Kenya and places to have off-grid solar, there was essentially no discussion of large scale. And as the price of solar dropped and as we saw more and more applications, while solar is still a tiny fraction, there are now groups sort of claiming that we'll be 100% on solar, in 6 months and all kinds of things. And so the pendulum of opportunity has swung so dramatically. It's nice to see this in the possible category. It's a little overreaching for where we are technically today. And in fact, a graph I'll put up just kind of tease those who want to think about the innovation side of the story for later is, this is probably my favorite history graph of any given technology. This is simply the efficiency of the highest performing cell. So very few of these, well, none of the dots on the graph here are cells in commercial production. But the highest efficiency of a whole variety of different material science applications, from some of the classic single crystal cells to some of the multicrystalline ones, to thin film and amorphous, to quantum dots, to organic cells, to all kinds of interesting new and emerging technologies. And you can read all kinds of stuff into pictures like this, right? One version is, what are the slope of these lines? Another version is, what are the slope of these lines relative to the amount of investment on the R&D side, on the deployment side, on opportunities? There is a wealth of information very much unmined to think about what have we learned about deploying these technologies. And there are versions of the stories that do things that are helpful and unhelpful at the same time. Thinking about things like, if we wanted to supply 50% of all U.S. passenger vehicles with energy from a variety of sources, the large ugly green color box here is all U.S. arable land. To do 50% with cellulosic ethanol, a very controversial fuel for a variety of reasons, and photovoltaics, all highlighted on here. And while this was meant, I'd like to think, when these graphs were first produced in the early 80s, to highlight the overall extent, then there were massive battles, and states said, well, I don't want to be paved with solar, whereas opposed to, hopefully that wasn't really the message. This can be distributed. There's a whole variety of stories, but it starts to talk about the energy density available in these technologies. What came true in solar is this remarkable story. And again, note this is logs. This is a learning curve, not a temporal or spatial curve here. So log cost of installed electricity and cumulative production log along here. And each of these dots along here are individually very important milestones in manufacturing, deployment, cutting a variety of features of solar cells. When this graph was made, we're a couple years back. Here we are. There are solar power plants being installed today that are cheaper than any competitor. Period, full stop, no footnote. There are some that are more expensive too, but some of the least expensive power plants installed anywhere in the world in the last 2 years were solar and wind. In the Middle East, they recently fully commercially paid for, they purchased a contract for gigawatt scale solar PV production at under 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And there was a big outcry, oh, that must be due to, that was a bizarre, companies going bankrupt to get the first deal. That deal happened in Abu Dhabi. 6 months later in Dubai, another deal of 2.54 cents came out. And so these numbers are remarkably low in the best locations. Now, of course, the sun isn't always on, so storage is needed or backup with some of the cleanest fossil fuels, et cetera, but it highlights the opportunity, and this remarkable transition has gone on for one technology. So it highlights, again, this upside, and if you start to think about combining what's going on in different technology areas like this, solar, wind, and others with what I just described for efficiency, there's an interesting story to be had about combining those things together. In the last 6 years, the price for photovoltaics has dropped by 70%, the price of wind power by 50%. Of course, that's in the best locations, and not everyone is equally well benefited from that. And the kinds of R&D programs that really made a big difference, and I'll just spend a second on it because I know I'm right up against the end of time here, but this is an analysis done by MITI in Japan that essentially coordinated basic solar cell research with funding on deployment. And you look at a graph like this today and just kind of, my heart just kind of gets all warm and fuzzy about how thoughtful this effort is. An effort to build up so what's above the axis is R&D money and what's below the axis is deployment funding. So here we have a concerted effort on the research and development side that started years before they planned the deployment, steadily ramped up over time. And of course, they delayed the start of the deployment effort and then ramped it up much more money went into deployment than in research. Very thoughtful program being put together. It's one example of the story. What we have in terms of U.S. energy funding is a little more complicated. So here we have the peak of energy research and development under President Carter, ramped dramatically down under Reagan, kept low under Clinton, and then Bush, and then in the 2009 stimulus package, energy actually received the largest piece of that investment. About $120 billion of the $800 billion that went into the stimulus went into energy, both energy efficiency and deployment and some research money. And it came back down after that peak to a, so far, a little bit higher level than the baseline before. And again, those of you who have sort of scientific careers in the room, think of both the interest and the excitement of getting a spike in investment, although do notice which piece got the largest piece of that. It was actually cleaning up coal. It wasn't actually the renewable energy options. Some of us don't really consider coal to be cleanable in some climate sense. But just think of the other feature of the story here, a massive ramp up in funding and then a massive ramp down, little better than the baseline before, but in terms of the gestation time for undergraduate degrees, PhDs, postdocs, new companies, that's a real worrying picture of the story. And again, so many of the skills that you all have in this room, I'll just put up a tantalizing picture just to highlight. Each of these graphs, and I won't talk about them in detail, looks at the R&D funding for a given area and the number of patents, recognizing the patents are not a perfect measure by any kind, and all I'm looking at is correlation here. But when you start to look in the details of many of these graphs, what's really interesting is that R&D patenting in the area seems, in almost every case, to lead new funding. It's as if some of those researchers have interesting products and technologies out there they're working on, and as they start to get a signal there might be support in this area, they start to bring these ideas out. And so there's some really interesting stuff that I just passed over because I want to end the story on time. I basically described this incredible drop in the price of solar, this ramp up in solar, and to end on, again, what I think is this kind of happy note. It's a coincidence to be sure, but at the end of 2015, the total global installed solar capacity was actually enough to power the 5th largest economy on the planet, which all, of course, you all know is California. So it's not all deployed in California, although 2/3 of all solar in the U.S. is in California. Number 2 state per capita in the country for solar. It's not Arizona, New Mexico, it's New Jersey. Because New Jersey put a tax on its utilities for emissions violations, and that tax went into a solar deployment fund. So I end with this. California's target for 2010 was to be 20% powered by renewables, and we missed that target and threw a big party, literally, and met the target 3 years later. The 2020 target, for which we are ahead of schedule, is 1/3 powered by renewables. And earlier this year, California passed, remarkably easily, I must say, the 2030 target of 50%. And every state and country defines renewables differently. There was a point in time, anyone from Maine in the room? There was a point in time when Maine defined natural gas as renewable. Maybe they were geologic scale thinking. I don't count natural gas as a renewable, but some states, so California does not count nuclear, nor does it count large hydro in this mix. And so when you start comparing around the world, not California is far from perfect, as we all know, but this is the solar, wind, biomass, geothermal part of the story here. And just to kind of highlight where we are, California has individual cities that jumped the gun, that went ahead of state regulation. Lancaster was the first U.S. city to say, no new home may be built without solar on the roof, period. No, what if you're under a tree, offset, no, nothing like that. Just simple passage of the rule. California is now the home to the largest thin film solar power plant in the world, the largest crystalline power plant in the world, the controversial but interesting solar thermal power plant in Ivanpah. We're going to be eclipsed by one in Morocco fairly soon. Here's an overhead shot of that facility. This is one of the oldest solar thermal power plants, commercial power plants, largest geothermal plant. New emerging technologies. This is a flow battery, because these flow batteries have wonderful characteristics about their lifetime. This is a solar-powered facility, relatively small, but it's giving hours of energy storage to balance the intermittency of wind and solar and other things. World's largest wind farm is in Kern County. As of today, more Kern County landowners receive revenues from wind than do from oil. We all know the Tesla story, electric vehicles, and what I didn't have time to get into because I spent so long in the loving introduction part was to note that almost all of the scenarios that we see getting to that 2-degree or 1.5-degree target are essentially massive electrification and massively clean electricity plans. So transportation largely in electrified or potentially fuel cell vehicles, complementing these clean grids. Number of countries around the world. This is an effort underway also in China, in Jordan, in Morocco, a number of European countries. And so what I haven't done is to get into the details of the technical parts of the solution. I'm hoping we do some Q&A on that, and I'll use the 9,000 slides I didn't show. The 147 more slides to go, minus the 30 or 40 I showed. And again, but I really wanted to try to make the case here that I really do think it's this translation into this communication story, which is much harder than the technical one. So I hope I've whetted some appetites. Thank you so much, and happy to do some discussion. You get the tradition is the first one, right? All right, here, why don't you pass that around?
Yeah, Adrian usually got the first.
Not yet.
Adrian usually got the first question in, so I'm going to ask the first question, but I'm also going to hand him the SETI mug.
Oh, my thanks.
Because he has to run.
I appreciate it.
So it looks very encouraging for fusion. Gravity-controlled fusion about 100 million miles away. I'm very encouraged. I do have a kind of a science question. I was going to ask a political question, but as we know, if you have a cup full of ice and it melts, the cup level goes down. So the Arctic's melting, and that should lower the sea level. But as ice comes off the Antarctic and ice comes off Greenland, it should raise. But is anybody worrying about the change in the Earth's moment of inertia as a result of the ice flowing out?
So there's actually quite a bit of talk about this. And just to put the numbers in perspective, as you highlighted, we don't have, there's no Arctic landmass, and so there's not going to be a significant effect there. It turns out there are actually some localized ones due to ocean issues, but they're regional. So actually, sea level is projected to fall a bit around Greenland, but go up dramatically in the equator, as you're alluding to here. But melting Greenland adds 10 to 13 meters of sea level rise. And Greenland is under very serious threat, decades ahead of where we thought only a few decades ago. That may be a bit of an allusion to fusion, but we'll get back to that in a bit. But if the Antarctic melts, then that's 60 meters. And so these are just dramatic numbers. And there's been a lot of worry because the forecasts made only a few decades ago were that these things were far further off in the future than we projected. There are now ice-free polar scenarios in significant chunks of the year that come up in the 2030s and 2040s. Far, far sooner than we thought. There's a lot of contested debate about when these will happen, but there is quite a lot of attention to what would be some of these moment and other inertia effects on our system. So it's a great question.
You had one slide where you showed the global average sea level went up about 20 centimeters from 1870 to 2000.
Yes, I did.
And I was just wondering, why was it that you also had an animation that showed in the last 30 years, like half of the polar ice was gone? So I'm trying to reconcile those two. Could you explain how?
Yeah. So this is not a simple story, unfortunately. So there's two elements of it. One is that our combusting fossil fuels has gone up exponentially recently. So you expect a much larger effect more recently. The other issue that complicates the story is that it takes quite a long time for CO2 molecules to migrate to the troposphere, to the stratosphere. So the total lifetime of a CO2 molecule is about 100 years, but a lot of that time is spent in the troposphere before it starts to be a significant impactor in terms of the global warming system. And so it's these two effects together, both the large weight of more recent emissions and the second story that the impacts are, there's a big inertia in the system to see the impacts from this. So great question.
About that picture that showed, the movie that showed the reduction in sea ice. Mm-hmm. If that's supposed to be real data and that's compelling, why does that scale of millions of kilometers not start at 0 to 7? Because it's definitely going to exaggerate the drop by not starting at 0.
Fair point.
People will point at that and pick.
Yeah, fair point. So yeah, I mean this is directly off the NASA site, so that's quite reasonable.
I was wondering about the cost of energy cost of production for solar and batteries and things like that. How much that offsets the amount of good you get out of them? I mean, how much it costs to produce all these things?
Okay, great question. There's a lot of analysis these days about not only what's the production cost, but often a metric that's used in the field is what's the energy payback? How much time does it take for a given device to produce the amount of energy required to make it, maybe decommission it, depending how you're going to do the math. And so the numbers are roughly, I mean, they're changing as you get innovation, but nuclear plants generally pay back their energy input in terms of manufacturing concrete and steel, refining, on the order of weeks. Wind farms typically pay back on the order of 5 to 7 months. Solar cells typically pay back on the 18-month to 2 years. And then that begs the question, what's the lifetime, what's the functional lifetime of these technologies? Solar cells are generally warranted for 20 to 25 years, with new ones now in the 30-year range. Wind turbines need significant part overhauls on the order of a decade. And I know that's the metric you're looking for, but that's the one that's most often used to think about these. In terms of prices, let me just maybe do the most raw version of the story, which is not just a hardware cost because there's a lot of market things involved. The least cost numbers I mentioned for solar and wind, about 3 cents, but we routinely, and many of you have solar on the roof of your home, I assume have priced it out. And for systems bought commercially in California, depending whether you took advantage of California or state rebates and whether you want to count that or not, it's generally for residential customers today at about 5 cents, and for commercial customers can be as low as 3, although those two cases I mentioned were in high insulation areas. Wind systems are generally in the 4 to 7 cent per kilowatt hour range. Nuclear is the hardest one to pin down here, because nuclear cost with or without, not just the reprocessing cost, but with monies that go into some of the funds around accidents, But the most optimistic nuclear numbers you'll get will be out of China today at 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour. The most recently installed U.S. plants, which I would argue are not representative because they've been so many decades delayed, are well above 15 cents per kilowatt hour. The most recent plants installed in Europe, in Finland, is at 9 cents per kilowatt hour with a government buy-in. And natural gas will typically be in the 4 to 6 cents. And none of that's including carbon prices or things. So just kind of give a feeling for both this payback and then the cost numbers.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so I liked your latent optimism towards the end with the solar. My major concern is the 1%ers and their control of the industry production, energy production, and not having a solution for them that allows them to keep their control. Because I'm assuming that basically all these solutions that you're talking about, the solar ones, I mean, they're totally democratic. You can basically take a solar panel, put it on your roof, and then basically generate electricity. So, you know, that will lead to political fighting and basically, you know, them, you know, fighting it tooth and nail. I think we're seeing that right now. So I guess I had a solution. I was wondering if you, you know, basically thought about it. Okay, so China recently announced that they're making in-place replacements for coal-fired boilers.
Yeah.
So you take an HTGR, directly replace it with a coal boiler, and just basically give the people the same revenue stream. I was wondering if you'd taken a look at that and, you know, how effective that is and their state.
So, I mean, there's a lot rolled into this question, which I won't get to do any kind of justice to. But one of the things that our laboratory does is to build what are called capacity expansion models of power systems around the world. Capacity expansion model is a model of the power system, modeling explicitly all the power plants, the transmission lines, and then investing money in energy efficiency, new generation, new transmission, whether it's traditional AC lines or high voltage DC lines. These are the parts of the world where we currently work with governments to build these models. They're big linear programming models to look at the costs, look where the revenues would go in various cases. And the China one is a very active area for us. We work closely with a couple groups in China to highlight what the different scenarios are to meet their kind of the peaking targets and things. And for China to think about this transition, it's quite a bit like a number of the U.S. states that are still very heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And so it's a very tricky story because of the following feature. The transition from coal to gas is considered almost universally as a good. The emissions per kilowatt hour of greenhouse gases from coal are generally twice that of gas. There's some leeway and range depending on the type of coal, the type of gas, the system, etc. However, what we observe around the world is that natural gas systems leak. They don't have to leak, but we observe that they do leak. And so an analysis that we produced for the White House and as part of our analysis of the U.S. West is the following. There's a big argument about what the leakage rate of natural gas systems, this is percentage leakage per year, either is or might be. Right now, the U.S. EPA number is that our natural gas system leaks about 1.5% to 2% per year. There are field observations of leakage rates as high as 16%, and there's a fair amount of data in this range here. And so what I've plotted for California is just what mix would you get based on that leakage rate. And so, of course, zero leakage rate. Here we have coal, our 2020 target, our 2030, 2040, 2050. And the red is the amount of gas that we observe leaking in the system. Looks like that's not answering your question. Right. Okay. So let me get to that. So gas is seen as the largest piece of many of these systems. In the U.S., as China makes a push out of coal into other things, including nuclear, but I'll get back to you in a second, this will play a large piece of that story. And so what this comes down to is managing the leakage versus the investment in what looks like the large midterm player in the 2020 to 2030 region versus longer term investments in lower carbon solutions, renewables, and nuclear. The current planned deployment of nuclear power plants around the world by 2030 is 60 plus or minus 5. 30 of those will be in China. There is no capacity to change that by an order of magnitude today. That doesn't mean we couldn't do a, whatever you call it, massive program to scale up dramatically. But what I'm getting at is that with China having well over 1,300 fossil fuel power plants, and the scale of deployment by 2030 being roughly 30, the nuclear option is interesting, but today is an incredibly small fraction overall. So is that not what you were getting at?
Basically, the idea is to take nuclear power, just replace the boiler. The coal boiler goes away.
No, I understand.
And they actually have a mass-produced plant that are now producing high-temperature gas reactors. And basically, you would just...
4. I was just there. 4. So there are many groups in the U.S. funded by Bill Gates. There's a big research partnership with MIT, one with a group at Berkeley, that are working on a variety of designs. There are pebble bed reactors, there are small modular, there's a whole variety. The challenge, I'm not disagreeing. I actually think that nuclear is going to be a large part of our long-term solution. The problem is the timescales I highlighted here is not one that we're currently looking at construction of anywhere near enough nuclear plants to make a difference on the climate lines. I'm not disagreeing with the potential.
Well, no, I get that. Maybe we can talk offline. I mean, I can show you the Incus that we're looking at a certain site.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically says by 2040, they're planning on having, because of the pollution smog problems, about 60 to 70% of their oil boilers replaced with this.
Yeah, no, I was right. So let's talk afterwards. I mean, this is an interesting point because this is kind of what I tried to set up in the kind of the motivation for the talk. I think that the technical solutions, whether you're a place that wants to be super aggressive on solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear, are all there. My concern in the framing here is then again, I just came back from meeting with State Grid in China, NDRC, the organizations that fund those efforts. No one that I've spoken with directly thinks that those large nuclear deployment numbers are really part of the plan. Now, what you say you'll do and what you do, I mean, maybe they'll go far beyond. Our meetings and our discussions are that this is a real worry in terms of what's the potential deployment to get there. But, I mean, if they do that, it changes the numbers dramatically, right?
Okay.
So, okay, sure.
Okay. I heard you say that CO2 molecules have a 100-year lifetime. I thought it was thousands of years.
No, the average lifetime of CO2 molecule, the one every time is about 100 years, 100, 108,
Well,
110 years.
what destroys it after 100 years?
What's that?
What happens to it after 100 years?
Yeah, so it's broken down, and there's a number of secondary pathways for both the carbon and the hydrogen.
Oh, okay, now you can hear on the internet that there's rise in undersea volcanoes. I'd like you to comment on that, whether this is true or significant or whatever.
I don't know. I suspect there's people in the room who know more about that than I. I've not heard that. So
Methane clathorates, maybe?
well, that's not well. They're different issue.
Thank you. You made a lot of wonderful comments, demonstrated a lot of knowledge and wisdom, and you did mention that there's been a lot of progress with the science, but much, much more is needed in the messaging.
Yeah.
And I'd like to share 3 points about, at least thoughts I have about how to improve the messaging. First of all, it's important to remember what Aristotle taught us. There is only 3 ways to persuade. And one of them, and most of the people participate in this activity, and that is appealing to people's need for logic. Another approach is appealing to people's emotion. The third approach is to make sure the messenger has credibility with the particular audience. That's point number one. Point number two, in the age of Trump, fake news, and the weakening of the press, it's important to look for new channels to reach people everywhere. In the United States, there's one of 3,000 community, people, education, government, television stations that provide programming to the communities throughout the country. Tapping into those 3,000 stations provide a new way to persuade. I don't have questions. Thank you. Not that I know everything, but I just want to share some knowledge that may be helpful to you.
Yeah.
Now, there are 300 community access stations in the state of California. Everyone is a potential for sharing the state's new initiative, which is mostly trying to find a way to reduce the use of carbon emissions. It is important, I think, to try to develop messages and distribute them through the 3,000 television stations, the access stations that are not being used, and to deliver them to the 3,000 stations in the United States.
Good idea. Three more questions, okay?
Right. Right. Send me a citation for a longer one. This is the IPCC numbers, but happy to happy to have it. Happy to hear.
I think after seeing all of the evidence for how much the climate is changing and what we need to do to reduce emissions, I think it can be quite frustrating because it seems as if our politicians aren't necessarily passing the legislation necessary to reduce it. And as I think you said that you'd gone before Congress, like what, in your opinion, do you feel like the politicians are thinking? Like, do they understand what's going on, or are they being misled by lobbyists?
Oh boy! So, great question. I mean, this is more than a talk answerable question. I actually think a lot of what was said before, with kind of the points about communication, is part of that. Is really part of that story. The federal process to investigate issues, climate and others, is essentially the subcommittee hearing in interrogation process, and that is one that it's based around equal and opposite views on all issues. And so when the Democrats are in charge, you get the majority of witnesses sort of saying things similar to what I said, and a minority saying what the climate skeptic, climate denier sort of arguments would be. And now we expect we'll have the reverse. So the majority of witnesses will be the other way around. And I'm not trying to make a value judgment either way, but I'm saying it is a process designed around a mix of witnesses either way. And so it's very hard in the U.S. Congress and Senate process to convince the other side, because the number of witnesses is roughly equal, not exactly, but roughly equal irrespective. It's one or two more for the majority side. And so you tend to get just about equal views back and forth on this. And it's not the only reason, but it's certainly one of the reasons why we've moved relatively slowly on areas that the majority, but not all of the scientific or technical community thinks is settled. And so I don't know, the question is about reaching the audience on this. The U.S. unveiled a very aggressive plan at the climate meetings in Marrakesh, this joint U.S., Mexican, Canadian statement on meeting the 2050 goals, so getting to that 80% decarbonization. And while many people, many of the experts loved the idea there was such a plan, what the U.S. essentially did was to say the amount of the growth rate in clean energy is going to continue as is. The current growth rate of low emission vehicles, be they biofuel cars done sustainably or more likely electric and hydrogen vehicles, will grow. And everything else that wasn't included, which is sort of 2/3 of the challenge, was dumped on the land use question. And it's because it's the area where we have the least data. So the area where we know the least, where there'd be the least pushback, was the place where much of this 80% reduction was kind of assigned. And the worry is that that's a nice political solution. It keeps the fighting down because we have to do lots of science on how much carbon can the ocean and the land absorb, et cetera, that it minimizes what essentially has been the California approach, the German approach, the Danish approach, the Portuguese approach, which is to maximize the amount of clean energy by aggressive mixtures of investing in science. And California is the #1 U.S. state on the investment side in R&D in the U.S. and the deployment side. So it's not really an answer to the question overall because there's not one single member of Congress. But the worry is that our process makes what you're describing very difficult. And we've done that to ourselves. So kind of a mixed answer to this really interesting question.
So I'm a big fan of carbon taxes. I heard you speak at Actera a couple of years ago. You talked about, I believe, a $70 a ton tax would completely transition the economy. In the China paper, I think I saw $40 a ton. Where are you in terms of what you think we should have for a
Right. So a very short answer to this one. I can't see us getting there without a price on carbon. And the reason is that we are right now doing all of the efforts we've done on solar, on wind, on nuclear with individual subsidies for different technologies, subsidizing behavior, subsidizing technology, and not holding industry, ourselves, and governments accountable just to do the math, not necessarily to move money around, although that would be nice, but just simply to do the math around, is a given investment larger or smaller? We're in Microsoft's building. Microsoft, in a very high-profile way, established an internal company carbon price, and there are a couple tweaks I'd like to see, but the consensus is that actually they saved money overall because it highlighted areas of waste. And so they were able to develop a strategy that meets these climate targets, and they were also able to find areas where they were already wasting other resources. So I find the ability to get there without that to be to be impossible or near impossible. And maybe the one hopeful bit of this Rex Tillerson discussion for State Department, which is challenging in many ways, is that he has gone on record as CEO of ExxonMobil saying we need a carbon price. And we need it to send clarity to industry, and we need it so that the accounting, both the good and the bad, will be out in the open. And so I actually think that's one of the few places where I see this opportunity for dialogue. So it's a great question. There are others who think that a carbon price will be far too small a lever because we have lots of other aspects that we may not put a price on, land use change, a whole variety of things. But I just think it's the starting ground that we need in this process. Sure,
I just wanted to thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. In the slide that you showed with the investment from government to alternative fuel technologies, I thought it was pretty interesting that the stranded sort of assets of clean coal got the largest investment spike. And I mean, from what I've noticed is that these stranded assets are like coal, fracking. It's essentially large infrastructure developments. So do you find that adaptation is going to be something that's going to be a big player in the future, such as the efficiency, smart grid technology, carbon sequestration? I mean, it's hard to move these large infrastructure.
So it's a great question. It relates back to your question in a number of ways. And Mr. Trump is talking about $1 trillion plus or minus infrastructure effort, and so there are clean energy people who are kind of jumping up and down because this is a great place to put it. They're kind of doing this kind of thing, and the challenge I have isn't where it goes so much as the fact that what you said is the likely piece. The largest ways to deploy the money will likely be the ones we lead on, good or bad. large infrastructure projects. There's not a whole lot of details in the Trump infrastructure piece, no surprise. But roads and bridges have been highlighted as a big area for that. And one of the arguments you can make is if we want to make these targets work, we probably ultimately would like to have less vehicles and less roads, whether they're internal combustion vehicles, hydrogen, or electricity. We just want less of these on the road. So you'd like to think that these would be opportunities. The push for clean coal came out of, this was 2009. We'd just had 8 years of President Bush, and there had been a lot of work on clean coal. There were some designs that had been worked on for quite some time. The U.S. government has essentially abandoned all of those clean coal concepts, meaning coal plants with carbon capture, largely because as difficult as carbon capture is from burning a solid fuel, it's even more difficult by burning gas. And the biggest opponent in the U.S. to coal today is not renewables, it's gas. And so it is a real technological challenge. The reason why it relates to your question is the science story I've described here is really about dramatically changing our emissions profile by 2050. And if nuclear worked, kind of the back and forth we had, if carbon capture were to work, it is very difficult to see it having this transformative impact by 2050, plus or minus a while. And the worry here is that, let me just take the nuclear case. There's 434 or so nuclear plants around the world today. Every one of those plants must be replaced, i.e. retired entirely or had a life extension with very new technology by 2035. And currently, your point's a good one, but currently there is no plan that even gets close to simply one-to-one plant replacement, not by 2050, but by 2060 or more. So, maybe China does this massive story, and China is a big piece, but it's not the only part of the system. And so thinking about how we can get carbon capture and storage, nuclear, other things, at scale on a timetable that meets this problem is more the challenge for me than in the long term. And just so you know, I should say there, I actually think in the long term, the likely version is your kind of comment about gravitational fusion in two forms, right? Well, fusion in two forms. I actually think that we are likely, assuming we get there, to be a fusion and solar world, which is, of course, a fusion and fusion world. Just one's local and one's not quite as local. But I worry about exactly how we spend that infrastructure money because of this timetable to address the problem, not on what the technologies can do in time. Are we doing one more? Or
one more here.
Sure.
Thanks for a fascinating discussion. I'd like to return back to the beginning, your talk about the difficulty in messaging. And I note that the Republican platform, to paraphrase, has said that federal research shall be based on the study of facts, not models, which sounds like that's part of the same problem. Are there some resources? Are there some people who've seriously looked at how we can communicate this for people who reject the whole idea of mathematical modeling?
Yeah, so that was the point you made in the back about how important the messenger is. And there's no question that no matter how well you're armed with the right amount of data or models or both, that the messenger matters greatly. And there are lots of times when a hearing in a Democrat-controlled House or Senate at the state or federal level is just not going to be listened to if the messenger is, yet another Californian, right? Who are all seen as, embracing all this crazy stuff. There's other times when it's the reverse, when you couldn't get enough Californians into the federal, sort of witness discussion process. And so this is one of the areas where I think we have done the poorest of all jobs. We have not figured out the mixture of messenger and kind of appealing on a technical or a financial or emotional basis. There's been lots of discussion recently about one of the big failings in the process was finding the areas where people who seem to have divergent views on individual global warming or fracking or solar or whatever else it might be, have common ground and other things working from there. And this is the part of the story, whether you want to call it psychology, behavioral economics, whatever it might be, where this effort, but also science and fact-based kind of analysis is most in jeopardy at the federal level. So there's no, I think there's no good answer to it. It is, I think, our biggest failing over the last 30 years, not given technologies that might have been further along than they are today. So I wish there was a... Well, I know. I mean, there's lots of websites I like, right? My conservative uncle in rural Pennsylvania, thinks they're all run by, mafia of California scientists, and so he won't go on them because he thinks he'll be tracked by looking at the NASA website, for example. So opinions vary, right? I love a couple. There's one called Climate Hot Map, and it is a global map, one of these pinnable maps that has cases of climate change on the science side, on the solution side, pinned with the papers, the data, the public battles. Climate Hot Map is one I like a lot. NDRC, the Natural Resources Defense, NRDC, NDRC is in China. The Natural Resources Defense Council, I think, runs an exceptionally good site on this. The University of the State of California runs a climate mapping site, Climb Data. There's a number of them that I like a lot. But again, the audience really varies on them.
So let's thank Dan again. That was a really good talk.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And thank you